Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Obviously, because of my father, we had this idea for Mr. Jay Yun to come up here and visit with you. Jay is a personal friend, and his wife is also a personal friend, equally as intelligent, I may say.
A little more so.
And Jay is someone that I respect tremendously for many reasons. His world has come from the intelligence background, and he has served his country in many ways that he will never talk about, nor shall I, but he is someone that is a true patriot of our country. And I just ask that you listen carefully to what Jay has to share today, because he is in the business of analyzing data all over the world. And when Jay and I were talking about him coming up here to speak to the Rotary Club of Greenville, we agreed that what is happening with China would be strategic and timely, and a lot of facts about happening with China are unknown to many people in our country. And Jay has been studying this for a long time. And without further ado, Jay, I'll just leave it to you to talk about the grand strategy of China.
All right, will do. Thank you. Okay, it looks like everybody can hear me, so that sounds good. As Marjorie said, I am by background and training an intelligence officer. I have been in the intelligence business in one form or another for, and this is hard to believe, 37 years. So starting first at a little international philanthropic outfit called the Central Intelligence Agency, based in Northern Virginia, and then ultimately with the United States Navy Reserve for 25 years. So I've had exposure to a number of different types of issues and various types of crises over the years. And what I'm going to talk about today is, in my mind, I think one of the most significant potential challenges that the United States has faced in many, many years. It's very different from what we faced during the Cold War, and very different in terms of scope and scale, and I think long-term sort of challenge to us as a nation. Let me give you a sense. About 3 weeks ago, a friend of mine who works at the Navy or Marine War College in Quantico oversaw a war game that he had his students, who he teaches, lieutenant colonels and majors who are doing a certain type of work at a certain time in their career. And one of the things he does is run war games. And this war game was very interesting. It was a simultaneous conflict where the United States and allies were fighting North Korea. We're trying to keep China from taking over Taiwan, and at the same time dealing with a Russian invasion of Europe. It was in fact, or Poland in this case, it was in fact the nightmare scenario that we could conceivably face, and it simulated about 2 weeks of war. And I think some of the things that came out of that are interesting in terms of what it says about the kind of world we are moving into. I won't go into the background of the scenario and how it got to where it was, but suffice it to say that what happened is that there were about, when all was said and done, in about 2 weeks of war, 150,000 estimated casualties of all, and that was just on the Allied side in almost every theater. The Allies were barely able to hold off the North Koreans in that theater. They ultimately stopped the Russians, but again, just barely. Taiwan, in fact, held out to some degree with U.S. naval and air support against the Chinese attack. The Chinese also contributed forces to the invasion of South Korea. But in about 2 weeks in, all sides were more or less exhausted. Supplies were beginning to run low. Chemical weapons had been used, which increased the amount of casualties that were inflicted. And the commanders of both sides were thinking about the need to use nuclear weapons. So this is in a war game, which gives you a sense as to how potentially dangerous the world we live in is, if in fact we're talking about a return to the kind of great power conflict that characterized much of the 20th century. But it highlighted all sorts of issues that we now, I think, have to begin to grapple with as we think about the challenge posed by China in particular, the inadequacy of much of our peacetime logistical infrastructure, the need to begin to think about our industry in a much more strategic way than we have in the past. The importance of allies. Had they not been available, we would have not been able to even hold in certain areas where we were fighting during the course of this game. Point here is that the adversaries were very evenly matched, and that is not something that the U.S. military has had to deal with for many, many years. So we're in a new world. And that world is one in which great power rivalry has once again come to the fore. And by the last time we really had to deal with the kind of environment that we're dealing with now, I would argue we haven't seen anything like this. Cold War was very different. It was essentially a bilateral contest with a lot of theaters where there was competition and sometimes conflict between the U.S. and the USSR and its proxies. But now we have a very much more fluid environment with a number of potential challengers, one of which stands out very greatly, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So in some respects, this is more like the world before World War I, or the world in the interwar era in the 1920s and 30s. Last time we faced anybody that was able to challenge the United States on some of the reasons that China is able to challenge it right now: economic, military, cultural, and ideological. The last country that was able to really do that was Imperial and then Nazi Germany. So that gives you a sense. I mean, the Germans played on all those levels, and sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But they were, in fact, able to compete and compete quite effectively. If you read any documents, if you're interested in this, let me suggest you read a couple of them, because they're out there on the web and they're easy to look at, and they help kind of frame the world we're going to talk about here. One of them is the National Defense Strategy, the National Security Strategy, which was put out in 2017. And that was done by former Secretary of Defense Mattis. And what that really does is talk in great detail about what the world we're living in is. And the central component of it is a return to this great power conflict that we've been fighting for the last almost 20 years, a series of essentially counterinsurgency wars in mainly the Middle East. And the military has become very focused on those kind of conflicts in terms of the way it's trained, in terms of the way it's organized. I spent 20 years in the Navy Reserve, or not quite 20 years, commanding units that were supporting those kinds of operations. And right as I was beginning to get ready to retire, I could see the need to begin to transition and train people to face this new world. It's not about chasing terrorists as much anymore as it's understanding the capabilities of some of these bigger nation-state competitors and what it is that they're capable of doing. So how did we get here? Why is it we're here now? And what was the kind of way this world came to exist? The United States was in a very enviable strategic position from 1991 to roughly 2004, 2005. There was really nobody that could challenge us from a military standpoint. We were able to do what we wanted to do, go where we wanted to go, and pretty much ensure that we had military, not just superiority, but I would argue in some cases supremacy in the areas that we were engaged in the world. We had the investment we made in the 1980s in our military held us well throughout that period, and we were mainly used for power projection and various types of interventions in a variety of different areas around the world. The economy was growing pretty well. We could support that. Great power threats were muted at that time. China was still in the midst of recovering and developing economically. Russia was in chaos. And so consequently, we felt pretty good, and were able to exercise power with a relatively high degree of confidence that we would be not only not challenged, but pretty successful wherever we did. What has happened is that we've seen a transformation in the past 15 years in terms of our strategic position that is in fact similar in size and scope, I would argue, to what was happening after 1945. But in fact, what we're seeing is an even more complex international environment. We face a number of diverse and growing challenges across various geographies and various spectrums of warfare. And again, we're going to talk mainly about China, but that's the most important challenge we face, but there are other ones as well. If you're interested, we can chat about Russia and the kind of power that it projects and the difficulties that it's causing in Europe. In fact, it's increasingly aligned with China. The cooperation that Russia and China are forging in Europe and elsewhere is, again, unprecedented. It's not something we've seen before. They, in fact, almost fought a big war against each other in the late 1960s and were considered to be adversaries for many years, but they have gradually come together and cooperated economically, militarily, and diplomatically in ways that I think were really unexpected and continue to be unexpected. So we have to deal with a highly complex environment, which includes, the remnants of these terrorist groups that we've been fighting, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in various places, as well as regional threats like the Iranians and the North Koreans. The Iranians are making noise even this week that has led to the dispatch of a U.S. aircraft carrier. And now we're having to confront that with an economic situation that isn't nearly as robust as it was in the 1990s, and with an alliance structure that is also much less robust than the one we had back in the 1990s, much less during the Cold War. Go look at what's happening in Europe right now. As you can see, many of our key allies are engaged in various economic or political crises that are making it difficult for them to project the kind of power and force that they were once able to do, the British being foremost among them. Anybody that's been to the UK recently will tell you that it's Brexit all the time, every channel. That's all they're concerned with. And so consequently, and that issue or ramifications from that issue are very much continuing to reverberate throughout the EU, which is undergoing a variety of crises right now. Now, there's some good news on the Allied front that I'll talk about in a minute that speaks to the challenge posed by China. In fact, we've seen several countries kind of rise to the occasion, in particular the Japanese, who now are, I would consider, probably one of our top military allies. Having been with the Japanese Navy and close to that country in a variety of different areas, both in business and in the military, I can tell you that they're a good ally to have. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about China. Here we are in this new, complex, much more fluid, and I would argue potentially dangerous international environment. What is it about China that is in fact so unique that we need to really sit down and think long and hard about the challenge that they pose? Well, again, as I said before, this is a multidimensional challenge. The Russians, the Soviets, really were a military challenger. There was a time when their ideology did in fact appeal to people, but that was a relatively limited time. And really, after a while, their ideology, or at least Soviet communism, lost steam over an extended period of time, and Russia began to act more like a traditional great power, but it was a unidimensional great power. It really could only compete on the military side. It never had an economy that was able to produce significant quantities of innovation. It had pockets of strength, but it was never able to produce significant quantities of innovation that would permit them to compete on the economic front as well as the military front. The Chinese are a different beast for a number of reasons. First of all, they have a very clear strategic goal, and they're not shy about this. You can go out and read about this. They talk about it. We're now much more systematic about how we mine Chinese public documents, but never underestimate the ability in the open sources out there on the web to tell you some very interesting things. And the Chinese are pretty clear about what they want to do. And their overall goal is to replace the United States-led international order with one that is centered on China. They believe that it's their time, that this is in fact the time for the Chinese to reassert themselves as the center of not just East Asia, but potentially much of the rest of the world. And from a historical standpoint, they're seeing this as a long time coming, because the Chinese had the biggest economy in the world up through about 1800, 1820, before the West fully industrialized. It wasn't as internationally linked in as it is now, but to them it's history reasserting itself. And so as part of achieving that goal, they have put in place a number of very specific strategic programs on the economic, cultural, political, and military fronts designed to achieve that goal. Let's talk about economics first, because that's in many respects where the Chinese are, again, very different from the Soviets and very focused on what it is that they want to do. I've had personal experience with this in the industry that I'm in that I'll reference briefly. The Chinese have a very unique model. It's a mercantilist system. That is essentially, what that means is it is essentially a system of state-directed capitalism in which the state is very focused on supporting critical areas of industry in order to achieve long-term political goals. There is no such thing in China as a private sector and a public sector that is separate. It is all one big continuum. They have a concept called military-civil fusion. So if I'm working in industry X, my job is to not only be profitable and expand and make that company strong, it is also to make China strong. And so as a result, I, as the leader of that company, am expected to advance the interests of the state as much or not more than I am even the company in some respects. There's no concept, for example, of shareholder value in the sense that we look at it here. So what they call this system is essentially central planning combined with capitalism, is socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's the phrase they use. And the Communist Party is at the center of everything. They run the show top to bottom. And we've seen over the last 3 to 4, maybe 5 years, that President Xi, who is the current leader of China, has increasingly not only increased the power of the party in terms of its role in every aspect of Chinese society, from education to the media to business to, of course, variety of other areas. But also, he has increased his own personal power. He has achieved a level of power that has been unseen in China probably since Mao Zedong. So consequently, we've seen this person achieve, and again, Chinese politics is a contact sport. If you were on the wrong side of President Xi, you either ended up dead, or if you were lucky, you're cooling your heels with an ankle bracelet on somewhere in an apartment in downtown Beijing. So this is not something that is a game for wimps. It is, in fact, a tough, brutal environment, and the guy, and it's usually guys that come out on top, is somebody that needs to be reckoned with. So the party runs the show. It tells everybody what to do, top to bottom. And this is, in fact, a highly centralized, extremely regulated economy at one level. There are private companies and state-owned enterprises that are given the direct backing of the state, financing to go out and take over other companies within China or around the world. And of course, the Chinese are engaged in a substantial amount of state-supported theft of intellectual property around the world. They have stolen hundreds of billions of dollars worth of theft IP from a variety of different countries, but their main target has been this one. And that is all designed to help the Chinese develop their economy. If you invest in China, you are required to provide them ultimately with the intellectual property that, that is in your company. That is a requirement, and that's part of the trade negotiations that are being talked about now to try to get the Chinese to back off that. And over time, you have to assume what you're doing there will be confiscated or in some way taken over. A friend of mine who's in the rail supply business had a very large capability there and was recently told, thanks for playing, we're glad you were here, this belongs to us now. And so consequently that he's writing off that several $100 million investment. They saw it coming, so they were prepared for it. Chinese got what they wanted, his technology, his stuff, and now they were beginning to fold it into their own areas. They have a program called Made in China 2025, which is which is basically a long-term plan to China to achieve strategic superiority in several key industry areas. And these include aviation, biotech, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, robotics, rail transportation. The idea here is for them to eliminate dependence of imported technology and for China to be the global leader in each of these areas. Let me give you one example of where they did this in the space of about 10 years. Was high-speed rail. They invited European companies primarily, but also Japanese, to come into China and help them build what is now the largest high-speed rail network in the world. Over time, they essentially forced those companies out, took their technology, and now are the largest manufacturer of high-speed rail trains in the world. They are taking those trains and they are exporting them to places all over around the world. They're bidding on the HS2 project in the UK. They are selling those trains in Africa. They are putting in a high-speed train in Hungary. So the point was that they were able to marginalize these companies over a decade, take their technology, and ultimately turn it to their advantage. That is classic tactics for how a mercantilist state works, and that's how the Chinese operate. There's another thing that you haven't read about that I suggest you might want to get information about. It's called One Belt, One Road, OBOR. This is another part of the long-term Chinese economic strategic plan. And what it basically is a massive state-supported effort to build infrastructure throughout Eurasia and throughout Southeast Asia and into Africa and even Latin America, all of which is designed to help link countries more closely together with China economically, and also culturally and politically. And what the Chinese do is they'll go out and they'll say, okay, country X, you want to build a railroad, or do you want to build a bridge, or do you want to provide some other piece of infrastructure? We'll help you do that. One case in point was in Kenya, where they hadn't put a new railroad in since the British ran the place back in the early 20th century. So they helped to build a new railroad from Mombasa to Nairobi. And they put Kenyans, what they do is they get these countries in a large amount of debt, and then if they can't pay back, they tend to then say, well, we're going to seize certain assets, or you have to turn certain assets over to us. This has happened in a couple of countries. And some countries are getting wise to this, but it's still not kept them from often welcoming Chinese investment, which comes with no political strings. The Chinese don't care who you are. You can be the worst dictator on the planet. They'll be more than happy to lend you as much money as you're prepared to take in order for them, if they think you're important enough to get it. So this is all about building bilateral relationships with key governments, giving them the financing to build these infrastructure capabilities. And there's also what they call the digital Silk Road, which is an effort to, again, put in Chinese fiber optics and communications in the same way the British did in the 19th century with telegraph and cables all over the world. They ran that for many years. The Chinese are very consciously doing exactly the same thing, with the idea of using their companies to set new standards, run these communication networks, and link everybody together as part of a larger system that is ultimately dependent and beholden upon China. So they're working to peel off U.S. allies like the Philippines with this, and they're encountering some degree of success. A key target is Europe. They're all over Europe right now. They are looking to separate the UK, which is, of course, in Brexit turmoil and needs all the support it can get by coming in with investment offers. They have been all over southeastern and southern Europe. They own the port of Piraeus in Greece. They own part of the port of Rotterdam. They are investing in all of these critical facilities where it makes sense for them to do so, again, as part of this conscious effort to build up this massive network of interlocked countries that are beholden or in some way dependent upon them. Italy, Greece, Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, Hungary, Switzerland, and others have all signed up for this OBOR program. So they're winning friends, as it were, through their willingness to invest on the scale that they're doing it. Ideologically and culturally, this OBOR and these other programs are accompanied with this idea that China, they're trying to put together what they call the community of common destiny. That's the phrase they use. And what that involves is basically saying, we don't care who you are. We're all friends here. We want to make this win-win, unlike the United States, which is going to tell you how to run your country and tell you about human rights and all the things you need to do and give you all these onerous conditions. We don't care. We just want to be friends. We want to trade. We want to do all these things. We're not in favor of dominance or military alliances. And it sounds kind of, pat, but it's actually very compelling in many parts of the world, in particular Africa, and to some degree Latin America, where they have made substantial inroads. And the United States really hasn't been paying attention until recently. They really haven't. This has all been being done for a long time under the radar. So, military. We talked about economics, we've talked about politics, and we've talked about culture. Let's talk about the military. And I'm going to focus on one aspect of that, because the Chinese have not neglected that. They have made a substantial effort to build their military from the nuclear forces on down to the conventional forces. And where we've seen the biggest advance is in their Navy. So the Chinese have invested in every aspect of naval power. Aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, missile launching submarines, nuclear missile launching submarines. They have built up a massive coast guard that they use very aggressively to enforce Chinese territorial claims in places like the South China Sea. Let me give you a sense of how massive that this has been. These are figures from the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London. So since 2014, China has launched more submarines, warships, principal amphibious vessels, and auxiliaries than the total number of ships currently serving in the navies of Germany, India, Spain, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom. So that gives you a sense of how substantial this building program has been. Since 2014 as well, China has launched naval vessels with a total tonnage greater than the tonnages of the entire French, German, Indian, Italian, South Korean, Spanish, or Taiwanese navies. So not only are they building more ships, they're building bigger ships. And we've seen via satellite photography, which these days is available on the web, the new Chinese aircraft carrier, which is going to be much bigger than the two they have now, likely have the kind of catapults, brand new catapults that we have, the electromagnetic ones that we're putting into the new Ford class. It's going to probably be at least 50,000 tons and able to carry a much bigger air wing than it did before. And they're also investing in things to neutralize our advantages. I don't know if you've heard of it, but they have a thing called the DF-26, which is a long-range anti-ship ballistic missile, which goes up, comes back down, and is specifically designed to target aircraft carriers. Don't know if it works, but it could. And if it does, their ability to project power, our ability to project powers off our aircraft carriers becomes very, very problematic. And those have been the centerpiece of our military strategy in many respects since for many years. During that war game I mentioned, when China entered the Korean conflict, the guys who were playing it had to pull their carriers back, so they couldn't contribute the air wings to the defense of the Korean peninsula. So they've read their Alfred Thayer Mahan. This is a textbook example of building a national maritime strategy that includes warships, logistics support capability, the establishment of overseas bases, which they've done in Africa, and a large civil fleet, merchant fleet to support it. And they're very active. We've seen them in the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and a variety of different areas. So they are really out and about with this new Navy of theirs. If you want to see what constitutes the real test of whether a country wants to be a really global great power or not, it's the building of a Navy. And Germans, the Russians, now the Chinese have been down that path very much in the last 100 years or so. Lacks combat experience, but they're catching up fast. So what is the bottom line? It's this. China poses a challenge of unique scope and scale in a multidimensional way that the USSR never did. It has a clearly defined strategy. Its intention is to transform the world order and center it around Beijing without proclaiming itself a hegemonic power. It's being very coy about what its real intentions are. It thinks history's on its side. He believes the world is reverting to a more Asia-centric order that preceded the rise of the West. And we're seeing as well in China the growth of strong nationalist sentiment, especially among young people, that is encouraged by the party state, which, as I said, exerts control over all aspects of Chinese life. So what we have to do, and I'll talk a little bit about that, is put in place a much more integrated long-term strategy in order to be able to deal with this. And there are elements of that the current administration is beginning to do, but we have a long way to go. And I give the current administration credit in its more lucid moments. It has actually begun to look at this in ways that nobody else really has. They were alive to the threat posed by China's aggressive economic diplomacy and economic statecraft in a way that nobody really has been. They're also understanding as well the importance of things like protecting our industry from being acquired by the Chinese. We have a thing called the Committee on Foreign Investment that has now been beefed up to ensure that they're not picking off selected elements of our industry and structure as they were before. And the Chinese have been huge investors in Silicon Valley and other places, and they've gone after very specific technology. They tried to buy a semiconductor company here, which we blocked them from doing. They galloped right over to the UK and bought a similar one. So this ultimately has to be a strategy that's coordinated with our allies. So what do we need to do? How do we need to address this? Let me talk a little bit about that. And oh, by the way, as I said, I've seen this up close and personal. In the industry that I'm in, we watched a Chinese state-owned enterprise called CRRC come into this country in 2015, and within the space of about a year, they set up a joint venture to produce rail cars in North Carolina. They bid on and won contracts for light rail in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and Los Angeles, using highly subsidized tactics where they undercut all of the other competitors by about $100 million. So they were able to quickly establish a beachhead. They set up assembly areas to bring the cars in from China. And I mean, you know, they touted the 200 or 300 jobs they created, but what in fact they were doing was looking to get a beachhead in this country from which they could expand and ultimately, as they did in Australia, drive out and destroy the local manufacturing industry. We saw that exact same scenario unfold in Australia. So I've seen this up close and personal, both in my life in the Navy and also in my commercial life as well. So what do we need to do? against a strategy that is this multi-dimensional, and we have to be much more integrated in our approach in terms of how we deal with it. We've got to basically look first to deter them from doing things that could be dangerous, and then, to use a word a friend of mine uses, attenuate. And by that I mean gradually wear them down in key areas. This is not something that we take care of overnight. We're going to have to look to play a long game. Engage with them as it makes sense to do so, but also deter them and block actions that can harm the interests of the U.S. and its allies. We also need to do a lot more investing in resources that can understand China. The bench of people who really understand what's going on inside China is pretty thin. And so, like we did in the interwar era when we invested in resources to understand Germany and Japan and then ultimately Russia, we're going to have to do the same thing. We've got to train more people in the language. We've got to get people who understand the politics, because Chinese politics is a really, really unique beast. And in order to understand where we may have some ability to impact what they're doing, we've got to understand the power struggles inside China, who's on first, who may be somebody that we can cultivate, who may be somebody we really need to watch out for. Right now, the fact that Xi was able to amass the power that he did and do the things, I would argue, caught a lot of people by surprise. And we're still kind of beginning to get out of that thinking that, well, these guys really want to be our friends. There was a long period of time where we believed that they would become like us, that they were going to become members of the global economic community that we set up. That illusion, thankfully, is beginning to die away. So, first priority must be to rebuild our economic strength. And that is the long-term sort of capability that we have to have. There will be no military, there will be nothing if we are not able to have the strong industrial base that we need. And that includes both defensive and offensive things. Defense, curb economic espionage, sanction Chinese companies that we know are using stolen technology, prevent predatory mergers and acquisitions, get supply chains out of China. Have companies that are there move those supply chains wherever possible and where they're manufacturing things. And we're starting to see that happen as companies are becoming much more wary of what the Chinese are doing. Counterintelligence used strategically is crucial here. We've got to keep the Chinese from using their intelligence assets to steal things, to influence our political system. They have been at this essentially unstopped for the last 10 years. And we are only now beginning to, all the stuff here about Russia, they're nothing compared to the Chinese, nothing, in terms of the scope and scale of the intelligence effort that they have and the influence that they're able to wield. For one thing, they're a lot richer, and so they've got money to throw around. We've got to do a better job of ensuring that we are protecting our defense industrial base and ultimately beginning to invest in new emerging areas, supporting companies where that makes to do so. That will be the foundation of 21st century economic strength and competitiveness. All those things I mentioned that the Chinese were investing in, we need to make sure that we're doing the same thing, helping companies where it makes sense, getting the government off their back where it also makes sense, so they can invest and grow with, and also making, I would argue, investments in our own critical infrastructure, which has been delayed and thought about for many, many years. Militarily, we again have to bolster our capabilities in areas that were directly focused on trying to make sure the Chinese aren't able to get their way in critical parts of the world. That probably means more of a focus on the Navy and the Air Force, but it also means adopting certain types of critical technologies like robotics and artificial intelligence and coming up with new ways to use those with traditional weapon systems operationally that can give us an edge. The Chinese aren't there yet. They still have some weaknesses in terms of some of the capabilities they have. We still have the edge in certain areas. We need to exploit that and accelerate our ability. Budget constraints will likely force some hard trade-offs. So we need to start thinking, as they say, when you run out of money, you got to start thinking, well, that's kind of where we are in some respects, and we need to really do that. Much of this competition, though, as I mentioned, is going to be ideological and economic, not military. So we have to lead by example around the world. And by that I mean we have to make sure that we're not squandering our power by needlessly intervening in places that are not part of the, that where we can see our resources squandered for an extended period of time and increase the wear and tear on our military. One of the things that's interesting about this is there's bipartisan support in Washington for a much more focused effort to deal with the Chinese. I've not seen an issue like this achieve the level of bipartisan support for many, many years. So this encourages me a great deal. I've talked with people on both sides of the aisle, both on my civilian and in my military side. So we've got the ability to, I think, put together a truly integrated strategy. And we've got to, and this is where the current administration has really been blundered, in my view, and that is we have got to make sure that we court our allies and make sure that they are on our side. What China is doing has really helped, make it, made a lot of people wary of them. And so we've seen, for example, the Japanese in particular really begin to develop their military and be much more proactive in terms of providing aid to countries overseas. India, Japan, Australia, countries like this are critical allies. Let's not beat on them. Let's not tell them we dislike them. Let's work together with them. Any trade spats we have with them are relatively minor compared to the overall challenge that we face from China. And finally, what we also have to do is be absolutely constantly talking about China's weaknesses and its true intentions. When they're, highlighting the oppression of their people, like the Uyghurs inside China, highlighting the corruption, highlighting the brutality of the regime, talking about all of the various things that we know constitute elements of of the nature of that country and the Communist Party. And that's the target. It's the Communist Party. We constantly have to frame our discussion around China about the Communist Party, what it does, and how it does it, because that's really who the villain in this piece is at the end of the day. So that is where our information campaign, our information warfare, if you will, has to be absolutely dead on and strictly targeted, closely targeted, to the point of where if we need to sanction individuals, which we're doing more around the world, we can begin to do that. And nothing gets the attention of these people, many of whom, by the way, being good communists, are also filthy rich, than when in fact you can begin to take down a bank account that they've stashed somewhere in Vancouver or Seattle or somewhere like that. So we have points of leverage. We have to get smarter about how we use our power. This isn't just about building more ships or more planes. It's about an integrated economic, political, and military approach to deal with a highly sophisticated adversary whose stated intention is to displace the United States global order, which in fact has brought us a longer degree of peace, prosperity than we've seen in much of human history. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions or thoughts. And, sir.
I listen to a lot of talk radio. Yesterday there was a great deal of talk about tariff with China. I heard the number 25%.
Right.
About quite a bit yesterday. What
Right.
are your thoughts on the effective
Tariffs
I
are,
know it's addressing the trade imbalance, and that needs to be done finally.
well,
What are your
tariffs are a blunt instrument, and I get why they're using them now. I think they're only a temporary fix, to be honest with you. I would be much more proactive in sanctioning individual Chinese companies and that we know have taken intellectual property. We had, for example, there are two major Chinese telecom producers. One is called Huawei, which you've heard a lot about recently, and the other one's called ZTE. We had ZTE on the map. We should have crushed it. We basically, because we caught them violating certain laws, we made it impossible for them to buy semiconductors in the United States. They almost collapsed. We should have allowed them to collapse, in my view. I would have crushed them like a bug, but in all frankness. But that, in my mind, is a much more effective tool than the use of tariffs. I understand why they're doing it, but in my view, I would be much more targeted in the kinds of things I did. We have, for example, been very aggressive about going after CRRC, the Chinese rail company, and what it's been doing here. This kind of thing, I think, is a better approach over the long term. But I get why they're using it. Yes?
I would really enjoy your observations on the information provided through Peter Schweitzer on the injection that we have with Mitch McConnell, Hunter Biden, the whole deal there.
What? I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I thought I knew where you were going, but what do you, oh, you mean the business things that he has done?
Business things
Yeah.
that he's done and the investment that he's doing in China, China doing through him, and also Mitch McConnell's wife being the relationship she has.
Well, unfortunately, they are not unusual. There are a large number of people. For example, one of President Obama's senior advisors on cybersecurity has recently signed up to be a lobbyist for Huawei in Washington. Not a great thing. Chinese are very smart about targeting people like that and giving them offers that they can't refuse. So part of the problem we're going to have is unwind a lot of this influence. This is their influence campaign. This is how they operate. They've done exactly the same thing in Europe. The former Prime Minister, David Cameron, now sits on some committee that the Chinese set up for Anglo-Chinese friendship or something. And so they're very smart about, and it's both Republicans and Democrats, Labor and Conservative in the UK. So that is a symptom of a much larger problem that we're going to have to start to untangle. And I think we're going to have to do things like, first of all, warn people off of anything having to do with investments in China and make that an issue in politics. In other words, you're going to have to raise it as an issue and say, you know what? That's not acceptable. You're dealing, you might as well be dealing with Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany. You can't be helping to support a regime that is in fact a massive, human rights violator. And also, I would argue we need to have U.S. companies list as a matter of course on risk statements investments they have in China. That should be as much a risk element as anything else on a balance sheet. That needs to be there as well. Boeing is now in a bad place because they've got a lot of business sunk into China. And now the Chinese are leaping on this 737 thing and using that as a wedge against them to extract additional advantages. So we've got to, again, as part of this campaign, educate people about how they operate and make it very, very, what's the word I'm looking for, bad for people to be engaged with China on this front. But they're not unusual. That scenario is repeated throughout the country right now. Yeah?
Your thoughts about our debt being owned by so much of China, the national debt?
There's several schools of thought on that. Some people see it as a real danger. Other people say that it's not really, that the Chinese are unlikely to be able to do much that would damage us, that they probably wouldn't sell that debt. They've sold some of it, and we haven't really seen much impact. So I'm not sure how much leverage that actually gives them. I think if it did, they would have done more with it up to this point, because right now they're kind of feeling pressure. But I haven't seen them do anything that would suggest they consider that to be a real issue. I mean, they're not going to do anything, I think, that leads to immediate pain. They're much more about longer-term erosion of U.S. power, not necessarily doing something that's going to lead people to focus attention on them. That's what they want to avoid. That's what they want to avoid.
What is your thought on the currency?
On the current what? Well, the Chinese are clearly after trying to make that a much more substantial international currency, and also put in place a system by which the U.S. Financial system is ultimately sidelined. And they've had limited success up to this point in making that happen, but they're setting up shadow kind of additional institutions, banks and other things, and looking for ways to try and make that happen. So far, they haven't had much success, but they're going to continue to do it. Most people are still more interested in sticking with the current system, since the dollar remains a relatively strong and favored currency. But there's no reason to believe that the Chinese aren't going to continue to try to do that. So far, they haven't had much success, but it's part of the plan that I mentioned. They're definitely trying to get the yuan to in the same place that the EU is, and the euro and the dollar are. So I think I'm out of time. If that's okay, very good. So unfortunately, I'll have to stop. But thank you all.
Can we visit with you afterwards?
Sure.
This video has been brought to you by Juice 34. GEUS is your community-owned provider for electric, internet, cable TV, and true local programming.
There is power in community. There is power in knowing your neighbors and working with people who actually live here, not out-of-town strangers. There is power in being based here, in raising our children here. In fact, at Juice, we believe there's nothing more powerful than hometown service. Juice. Hometown service, world-class reliability.